I'm going to go into some collection of videos that I've shot in the 70s and 80s, most likely. Paul and I met in the 70s. I was a structural engineer and he was doing a project about Atlantis. And so I visited him in his studio. And I had been looking, while I was an engineer, at various visionaries. Buckminster Fuller was alive. Paolo Soleri came from Italy and he started building futuristic cities, so to speak, different than what cities are traditionally, from the Roman time all the way through to the modern era. And in those years, in the 70s and 80s, there were many people that were thinking somehow about the future in certain ways. So Paul and I met, and at some point we ended up making a proposal in conjunction with Joe Aiello, who had the idea to develop the Boston Harbor Island in some culturally unique ways. So Paul suggested to design a sort of philosophical museum, let's call it, chrono arc. It was supposed to be designed in such a way where various concepts that people didn't agree upon would be built into the structure and therefore allow humanity to come to terms with their own language, their own conceptuality, and maybe finally find world peace. So I invited him one day into my room in Central Square, and so he put as many drawings and sketches as he had on a wall and explained to me the concept of what he had in mind. We subsequently made a proposal, but it didn't really go through. The people that wanted to help us wanted 10% of the profits, but we didn't really know anything about profits. We were just thinking in philosophical, conceptual terms. I came into the situation using video because I had been a structural engineer, computers, cybernetics as they were called, very came into the engineering process, and I felt computers alone were only dealing with digits and numbers, and the human element potentially was not included there. And I thought video, by having a person, I'm talking, you're seeing me involved, was one way of tying it into the design process. So I, after leaving engineering, kind of became a member of the visionary cell. I was also a member of other groups in Central Square who attempted similar final attempts. So during those days in the 80s, while the visionary cell was going on, there were various groups in the Boston area working on contemporary issues. Paul subsequently asked me many times to come into galleries where he had exhibits. And so we're seeing here some of the things from that time. I experimented with video as a new design tool with no other ambition in mind other than peacefully staying in the background and helping to facilitate various projects to come about and move them along somehow. This was, of course, all before we had the internet. So many of those things that were then recorded or talked about have subsequently come to pass, according at least to my experience, because in the days when I started videotaping, or when these videos were recorded, they were recorded on half-inch video, and so these are digitized images of half-inch video. This is a proposal that Paul made of, I believe, New Jerusalem.
This is a model of that house. Some of the features of it are like 5 Aeolian harps that will be tuned to the pentatonic scale. Now, a musician friend of mine is working on dealing with the overtone series of that. So these will be like sound healing. And then there'll be color healing window experiments in this really what is essentially this passive solar area. I don't have the rest of the plans here, but inside there's a balcony that goes down into the lower area. Then I figured out how to grow a tree upside down, because the tree of Sephiroth has its roots in heaven and the foliage on earth. So with 5 palm trees, young palm trees, that are bent.
Here's another member of the Boston Visionary Cell, who, the magic man, he would invent various instruments. And so usually when the group would show up, there were poets. There was Brother Blue, was a very important part of, and would show up at various group shows. This is a structure of a Urpflanze that Paul made. We did a show at the Goethe Institute. Goethe, a German poet and botanist and scientist, had the idea that there was this aboriginal plant maybe from which all plants have originated. And so we had this group show called the Urpflanze, and since there is a Goethe Institute in Boston, we had a show there at the Goethe Institute. Paul would also then develop an idea of how actually an organically grown house could be potentially made in the future through altered form of biology, designing biology in such a way that where it could be programmed to develop and grow in certain ways, grow as structure, as building material. This was in the days where we were building in reinforced concrete and structural timber and the like, so the idea of growing houses organically seemed a little bit far out, but we had, these are still images of the exhibit at the Goethe Institute. This is Goethe and Schiller. These are two contemporaries of that time in Germany that were very popular during the time that Shakespeare was popular during English language development. Goethe and Schiller were the ones in the German language. And Paul was always very intrigued by certain German terms. Zeitgeist is a German term which literally means time and spirit. Or so a lot of those terms occasionally became into use to help get away from a very mechanistic worldview. Paul's approach to reality was, in a way, to almost invent his own language to describe realities that otherwise in traditional scientific, technical business language couldn't be expressed. From Goethe Institute, we went to an exhibit together that had to do with, I think it was called End of the Future, and it was for the World Future Society. It was somewhat in a challenge to whatever World Future Society was throwing out. This year, still me talking at Goethe Institute about I had this feeling that our language had to be changed because we were just too stuck in certain terminologies. I was intrigued by the Platonic solids, which Paul had also used in his first work that I saw, which was the Atlantis Project. And since I had been inspired by Buckminster Fuller, who in his lectures typically spoke for at least 4 hours and always had a tetrahedron on the table and occasionally needed to pick it up to make a certain point. I later on, I didn't really want to call my work by any name. I just wanted to use the symbol of the tetrahedron. But then when we went to the World Future Society to talk about end of the future, Paul asked me to talk about how the concept of the noosphere, the sphere of the mind, that Tyler de Chardin talked about. And there was also a Russian mathematician, I believe his name is Vernadsky. He expressed a similar idea. I made the attempt to talk about how the videosphere could be made visible. In other words, how the noosphere, the sphere of the mind, could be made visible in the videosphere. I attempted all along to find a language that would be a global language. According to Buckminster Fuller and according to what we know now, we're living in space on a what we call planet. Buckminster Fuller sometimes called it a spaceship. So my feeling is, in order to grow up as humanity, you had to develop a consciousness that was beyond the box, beyond, the globe, the planet. At some point was described that to sailors, if they would sail out too far, their sailing ship could fall off the edge or something like this. So, conceptually, in terms of how we see the world, our worldview was somewhat limited, and we were quite aware of it. And the attempt of Visionary Cell was to help expand the worldview or to have discussions about it. And that means in the both physical and parapsychological, metaphysical sense. Here, Paul is explaining the idea of prana, the breath exhausting from the body, carrying energy. I believe this recording was done actually at Kent Gallery in New York City when the book about phenomenology was published. This was in the 90s, I believe. Subsequently, after talking to World Future Society and dealing with the terminology videosphere, which had been used earlier by alternative video people in New York. They had traveled through the world. That means Europe, Russia, and brought their video gear with them, and essentially established television monitors, the whole technology to make picture and introduce it to people, because people at some point, television was Big Brother watching. And so we went through a period where the attempt was made to give the power over to the people, who at some point were assumed were incapable of organizing or governing themselves. So the big leap from when I thought of videosphere, I was thinking about a future whereby new building techniques, new techniques to produce food, to clean water, just a whole new way of recycling all energies would be part of the new structures and the way to teach this to the people, the way people...
And all of the pollutants that were coming down on you would be taken care of by the plants. So it's like living in a garden where the garden's taking care of you rather than you taking care of the garden. reading Teilhard de Chardin. I know you were talking about him in the beginning, because he moves towards a world which makes time have a sense, have a finality to it, which the secular world does not permit.
As a visionary cell, we had shows about lucid dreaming, art and lucid dreaming, which brought a whole new group of people together. It was done in the Federal Reserve Bank. There were people invited from Boston University and other scientists who had done some work in lucid dreaming. Paul talked about it there. We had again Brother Blue being there doing a performance, and I presented a little video installation. One of the earlier experiences that I remember now sharing with Paul was going to the Towards Tomorrow Fair. This was in the days in the 70s, I believe 76, and one was 74. The Buckminster Fuller was still around, and people organized for a show towards the future. Here we are at Cambridge CCTV. I had made about 7 tapes, and in a program of 1 hour and a half, I played excerpts of 7 tapes, and I had Paul there with me, and we were discussing what I had been recording.
I think that everyone is seeking a way to be constructive, and that now that we recognize, the velocity of media is now the speed of light. It's not the 700 miles per hour within the thinking of our own mind or a horse and buggy anymore. It's there, so that we will transcend. My original opinion is unaltered from 1973 when we first met. I think that the whole videosphere idea is the next stage after the United Nations.
When we have all this technology in place, we don't really need to be governed anymore in the way that was required before, where we needed to have government buildings and organizations as we used to. We potentially have to go into a future that most people are not accustomed to envisioning, because we have seen, since I came to America in the 60s, I've been bombarded with German war movies. War movies get played over and over as if it's the lifeblood. And so we kind of stuffed with war and disaster information, and we're not even used to seeing information that leads us to envision a positive future. A positive future is, according to the vision that Buckminster Fuller had, he said there's either going to be utopia or oblivion. And so it's up to us now to decide which way we want to go. And my feeling is, as the artist community, perhaps, is best suited to develop a form of language that will then finally include everyone else, either to help them come out and join the performance, pick up from other people what they're doing, and gradually get used into this other type of lifestyle, which, for lack of a better word, would be utopia. Personally, I like to avoid these terminologies because they usually get argued by someone else. We're so used to playing devil's advocate, but devil's advocates at this point in time are not necessary anymore. They're sort of totally irrelevant, because they're taking the energy that it takes to create away. They're just taking it. It's like a in computer terminologies, there used to be a thing, it was a loop. It was just something that they would freeze and then had to be fixed somehow, because nothing ought to be stuck in a loop. A cancer is like a loop. It's a self-defeating organism. The Boston Visionary Cell focused primarily on almost metaphysical aspects more than, because we came then in the 80s, 70s out of a very physical time. You know, it was the time of mutually assured destructions. We had developed in our society so many nuclear weapons that there were discussions about what do we do with the waste that was accumulated. There was really a big fear amongst people about, you know, the technology we had created and the problems that they created. Just alone the nuclear weapons issue was big. The environmental problems were discussed in those days. So, like I said earlier, the visionaries were Buckminster Fuller at some point, and then there were many other people there. And Paul, in a way, he collected many books. He studied a lot of stuff. His studio was filled with items, and so he was a source of for other artists to not so much be stuck in their own thing that they were doing. He was continuously encouraging people to think a little further than conceptually, particularly. He would take language apart, like here, you know, he has the swastika in his paintings, and then he goes into the left and right. So then on the other side, you see the swastika, which turns one clockwise, the other counterclockwise. You know, one in certain meanings, one means a positive energy and a negative energy. But these are all linguistic terminologies that exist and were discussed. So what brought me to the Visionary Cell was that I had left engineering, hoping that video would allow us would give us a language tool to help us get out of the trap that fixed language presents in a way. For example, the Lakota, which we had visited, their language was actually never written down. They feel language is a spirit language, and therefore language changes as spirit requires it. So there's a problem when we write things down and then they are fixed in a way. So those kind of things were discussed by Paul. Paul also brought up the whole issue of extraterrestrials or flying saucers, where in his work he was one of very few people that I knew who would even bring this all in one subject. But we are living in a time now where, in particular now, since we're communicating amongst each other over internet. When I started with the videosphere idea, the mass media was controlled, and we thought by people getting their own cameras and communication tools, it would open up the channel. But what it really opened up was, as Buckminster Fuller told us, that when the technology of television and computers merge, by computers we mean then, of course, with the internet, of course, then we would have actually the tools to make it through the future, because people kept looking at him for answers, you know. And it's so even Buckminster Fuller suggested many things that ultimately, in a practical sense, didn't make sense. But in order to explore, you have to deal with subject matters in a playful way, and in your play discover new things. So in other words, you're playing, you're discovering without there any being intent of, you're stumbling into things. I've done I've been in many sessions that people had about vision, future, and so what I learned at some point from someone from the Waldorf school is if you're searching for something by having it fixed in mind, it's very hard to find it. But if you kind of go about it in a very open and playful way, you might just discover it, and all of a sudden you have this aha moment. So this is partially of what brought me into the visionary cell. Also, doing video, you have to be part of a group in a way. You can't really do it by yourself. So the group activity was very interesting. There were people from the Psychic Science Research Group of New England came and joined the group, and so there were many sessions that were on the parapsychological level, included in visionary cell activity. Subsequently, in the 80s, not in the 80s, by 2000, I stopped recording on videotape and had to change to digital recording, which opened up a whole new world for me. This is one part where a lot of my contemporaries stumble and don't go, unfortunately. And so I've been spending now 13 years dealing with this whole new digital world and sticking with it. And Paul was actually in the middle of a group of people who has had various experiences. Pretty much, I would say, a grounding element in this community of artists.
Yeah, to quote Brother Blue, it was in the middle of the middle of the middle. that was his favorite phrase.
And so talking about back up to the video sphere, so that I came along and I thought, okay, since this is electronic reality, we have to make, Paul thinks there could be an electronic reality that replaces computers, and then where we get somehow through this energy what we need.
We're almost there.
Oh, yeah.
I swear that I will live through a time when the entire Earth is covered with a coherent electronic information, so that you can know all the things that are going on around the Earth, no matter where you are on the Earth. And this was, I think, a part of the dream of Tesla.
Mm-hmm. Well, he, of course, they didn't like his work because he couldn't. They needed some way to put a meter in this so they could charge people. His idea was to get it all for free, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what we're moving to, a free society. I mean, free from economy.
Yeah.
I mean, they spent the whole time last night talking about the economy and who didn't do that stuff. But the thing is that if we could get rid of the economy, we'd be doing well.
Yeah, so people are working on it.
Yeah.